Ladies and gentlemen, kindly make your way back to the auditorium as we are about to start our next session. Once again, we would like to ask our participants who are in the hallway to kindly make their way back to the auditorium as we are about to start our next session.
May we ask everyone to slowly take their seats? We'll be starting the session very shortly. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you're all refreshed after our nice break. So earlier this morning, we had a very enriching discussion and exchange on integrated solutions, talking about social protection as an enabler across sectors. In this next panel discussion, we'll look more into the role of inclusive social protection, delivering on the SDG agenda to leave no one behind. So this will be moderated by Gi-Soon Song, Director of Human and Social Development of ADB's Sectors Group. Gi-Soon has over 20 years of experience in international development. She led various ADB programs and projects in education, skills development, health, and social protection areas in South Asia and the Pacific for over 12 years. Before joining ADB, she was with the United Nations Development Program, where she was involved in governance and poverty reduction programs. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Gi-Soon Song.
Thank you, Mitch. Welcome to the second plenary session of the day. This morning, the keynote speech and the earlier plenary session highlighted the role of social protection in inclusive growth and then social cohesion, and then explored the ways to create a larger impact through intersectoral approaches. In this session, we would like to focus on the social protection's role in achieving the Sustainable Development Goal 1, as Mitch introduced, which is ending poverty in all its forms, everywhere. How can social protection help leave no one behind? It is my pleasure to introduce 4 eminent panel members to share their insight on this overarching question. To allow more time for panel interventions and then do not eat up your lunchtime, I will introduce them very, very briefly only. First, Dr. Katinka Weinberger is the Chief of the Sustainable Socioeconomic Transformation Section of United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, ESCAP. Dr. Abdul Malik is the Minister of State for Ministry of Gender, Family, and Social Services, Maldives. He's currently overseeing social protection initiatives. Followed by Ms. Tamila Baklaya. She is the Deputy Minister, Ministry of Internally Displaced People from the Occupied Territories, Labor, Health, and Social Affairs, Georgia. She has a lot to cover. She's been the main driver of key reforms under the ministry. Last but not the least, Professor Philip O'Keefe is the Professor of Practice at the University of New South Wales Business School. And then he's also Director of the Aging Asia Research Hub at the ARC Center of Excellence for Population Aging Research. So just right into the subject, let me start with you, Katinka. ESCAP, along with the other development partners, has been closely monitoring the social protection coverage in the region. How Asia and the Pacific is pairing in providing effective coverage. Who are at the danger of being left behind? What are the notable trends? What are the regional or international frameworks or agreements are in place? And then how do they reinforce the regional or country commitment to expand the effective coverage? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Gisun, and thank you also for the invitation to the panel. I would like to share with the audience an overview bar chart on where we stand in respect to protection and coverage with social protection systems in the Asia-Pacific region. What this chart shows you, if you look at the lowest bar, is that the majority of people in Asia and the Pacific are not covered by social protection schemes. And this increases the percentage is around 55%, and this percentage increases to 66% if you include China. So this means that 2/3 of the population in Asia and the Pacific are not covered. And then when you look at specific population groups, especially persons with disabilities, are widely excluded from mainstream social protection schemes. This is despite them being at larger risk of poverty and usually having a higher cost of living expenses. But I would like to also point out that the coverage of child benefits is particularly low, which, given that children represent our future workforce, our future tax base, and also caregivers in an aging society, will have significant implications for future sustainable development. But then at the same time, simulations that we have conducted within ESCAP actually shows that child benefits have the single largest poverty reduction impact of all benefit categories. Let me just quickly move through some of the other areas. Coverage is also less than 1/3 for unemployment and employment injury, just slightly higher for maternal benefits. Despite the importance of healthcare, around 1/4 of the population is not covered, and old age is the only contingency in which the majority of populations is covered. But the adequacy of old age pensions remains low, and while the life expectancy of women is higher, their access to old age income and security is much lower as compared to men. And then let me also briefly talk about what is not shown on this graph. Migrant workers face exceptionally high levels of exclusion from social protection because they're typically employed in sectors with high informality, and they lack access to both contributory and non-contributory programs due to their residency or their migration status. And then finally, the dominance of informal employment in the region means that around 1.3 billion people are left more or less unprotected. Informal workers are usually not covered, and they can also face challenges in accessing poverty-targeted non-contributory benefits. And people trapped in this situation are often referred to as the missing middle, which is left out of any form of protection. Could I ask for the second slide, please? You had asked about key progress and trends. And I would like to emphasize that we have seen some good progress in the region, countries moving towards inclusive social protection systems. This is in terms of the extension of coverage. We see some countries that have achieved universal or near universal coverage of children, also extended maternity protection coverage, and also a number of countries that have achieved close to universal coverage for older persons. There have been some trends that have accelerated, especially during the pandemic, with an increasing focus on establishing contributory schemes to strengthen resilience of populations. For example, the establishment of unemployment benefits and work-related contributory schemes in Indonesia or the Maldives. We also see that governments are increasingly working to expand the coverage of previously ineligible populations, such as informal workers. There are innovative ways to collect data and to identify beneficiaries from lower income communities. For instance, the introduction of the IP-Poor system in Cambodia, which is a community-driven proxy means test. And as, for example, we had heard yesterday, there is also much progress on the digitalization of social protection information systems and payment systems. And we see that payments are delivered more efficiently and effectively. But there are a number of critical barriers and challenges that remain, especially in terms of access to both contributory and non-contributory schemes, where legal frameworks continue to constrain the participation of certain categories of workers, which again leads to very low coverage for self-employed workers, workers in micro and small enterprises, agriculture workers, construction workers, domestic workers. There is the lack of effective enforcement of applicable labor and social security regulations, which contributes to a low level of compliance amongst firms. For non-contributory schemes, many of the schemes continue to be poverty targeted, and they use proxy means tests to identify beneficiaries. And we see that this typically results in very high levels of exclusion error. And then finally, the lack of information and awareness, which concerns Social Security, which overall contributes to low registration of those who would be eligible for Social Security. But it's for specific categories of people that we are especially worried that exclusionary patterns remain. This is for women, disabled, and then I would also like to point out that despite an increasing migration flow both within Asian countries as well as Asian Pacific countries and the rest of the world, there is a lack of social security portability arrangements. So in sum, although there is good progress, obviously much more needs to be done. And then just very quickly turning to the last part of your question on the implementation of regional frameworks. If I could have the next slide, please. I would just like to point out that key international and regional frameworks have recognized the importance of social protection as a core building block. I would like to point out the ESCAP action plan to strengthen regional cooperation on social protection in Asia and the Pacific, which serves as a shared vision, a shared platform to promote and to learn from each other in terms of developing integrated and comprehensive social protection systems. And we have been supporting a number of countries in the region, including, in fact, Georgia and the Maldives, to take stock of their readiness to implement the plan. But perhaps more importantly, also talking about inclusive social protection systems that was discussed this morning, we see that there's a strong recognition of social protection also in frameworks that go beyond social protection per se. In the context of, say, the Declaration on the Asian and Pacific Decade of Persons with Disabilities, the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, for which we have a regional review, the regional review of implementation of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, and the Asia-Pacific Declaration on Advancing Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. All of these are frameworks that have an explicit recognition of social protection, and therefore, in a sense, helps to connect the dots that we were referring to this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katinka. Obviously, the achievement, the progress section is short, and then challenges section is like a big. It's not really a coincidence. There are a lot to be done. And then I would like to actually turn to Malik. Katinka actually highlighted some of the regional kind of framework and commitment. Then sometimes like a social protection agenda is also politically driven within the country. So I wonder, because government of Maldives has been very proactively engaging with these regional and international agreements and framework, including the review of Madrid Implementation Plan of Action on Aging and the Jakarta Declaration on the Asia-Pacific Decade of Persons with Disabilities. So this is like a very notable contribution. But how do you see such commitments are actually helping you in developing inclusive social protection in the country?
Thank you, Kasun, and thank you, Katrina. Um, to start with, good morning, everyone. I would like to thank ADB for this opportunity, and I'm honored to be among such esteemed people on this panel. Before I talk about the international and regional commitments, I would like to point out the fact that Maldives has a constitution which is very much aligned with giving social protection to everyone across the board, which includes race, national origin, color, gender, sex, age, mental or physical disabilities. And we acknowledge steadfast commitment to upholding the fundamental principles of equity and providing equal opportunities to inclusive participation by everyone across the society, especially women, children, and older persons included, and also people with disabilities. Coming back to SDG 1, no poverty, Maldives is on track, and we have eliminated extreme poverty. So that's one achievement that I would like to highlight. Similar to SDG and other commitments like CEDAW, CRC, and CRPD, we also have, as mentioned by Kasun, we have other regional commitments that have been made. And with this, we align our policies, and we are essentially tapping into a vast pool of global best practices when we make these commitments. And since they are evidence-based, even though we need to contextualize it to our national context, it is very helpful for policymakers, and we are able to identify the gaps in our policies and come up with frameworks which are more applicable and more adaptable to our country. And since the international or regional commitments are tested and proven strategies, that is an advantage that we have, and this is one reason why we give importance to these commitments. One other very positive thing that I would like to point out is that the collaboration that we get when we are part of these commitments, and monitoring and reporting of our work is part and parcel through these commitments. And also these commitments come with support mechanisms, technical support, budget and funding opportunities as well, and resources from developmental partners, which is very helpful when we are rolling out these instruments or commitments. And it gives rooms to for us to adapt this and come up with local legislation which helps it to be sustained within the system in long term. Like our proactive engagement in regional and international commitments relating to especially aging and disabilities is a good exercise, and it is a profound commitment that we're making. And the progress that we have made on social protection of these two vulnerable groups is profound even at present. And the regional commitments are a roadmap for our policy development, and we utilize this such that we are at par with the region, and also make sure that it is locally adapted, and that no one in these vulnerable groups are not attended to. So just to conclude, us having been part of these regional and global commitments helps us to improve things locally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malik. While the international framework actually helpful, but I think the policymakers' ownership of the principles enshrined in those framework is like a most important to actually translating these commitments to actions. And then it's not like a bureaucratic action, but it's really like a government fulfilling the obligation to the people that really kind of strongly hitting the chord. Now, I would like to move to Tamila. As Katinka highlighted, the least effective coverage is actually among the people with the disabilities. But I heard you're doing some very exciting initiatives under your ministry. So would you like to share that what are the programs that you're doing, or the reforms, the objectives, and the progress so far? And then how do you measure the success?
Thank you, Jisoon. It certainly is a pleasure and an honor to share our limited but very fast-paced progress that Georgia has over the course of last decade when it comes to protection, including social protection and rights protection of people with disabilities. Now, when I will give you a short context. Georgia is a small country of 3.7 million. Our taxes are one of the lowest in the world. It's 20% tax, and all of our social protection programs are general revenue funded. So when we're talking about limited resources, you really need to prioritize and to use resources effectively when it comes to general revenue funding. And that's what we've been doing when it comes to protection of people with disabilities. We've been prioritizing and putting people with disabilities on the top of the agenda of the government. The proof of that is that when it comes to cash remittances, people with disabilities in Georgia do get, all people who are granted the status of disability get cash remittances. And last year, the cash remittances were indexated to ensure continuous increase of remittance based on the growth of GDP and inflation rate. So that there is no political will necessary, but it's enshrined in legislation that the remittances will be increasing on annual basis. And that's what we've been doing. We also have a targeted social assistance program that we are remodeling and updating the methodology. And one of the priorities of TSA, it's a proxy means tested formula-based cash remittance, that is evaluating the poverty of household, and based on the poverty rate, the remittances are given. And one of the priorities in the identification of the needs is the disability and disability status. But when we discuss disability and social protection for people with disabilities, we cannot only base our discussions on cash remittances. What matters in addition to cash remittances is access to healthcare and access to social services. We do have universal healthcare program in Georgia, and it's fully state funded. And the government is funding 80 to 90% of the healthcare costs in the country. And we've been reforming the systems to ensure that out-of-pocket costs are decreasing, and the healthcare is free for the population. And people with disabilities are as a priority target population for our healthcare programs. However, when it comes to social services, they are comparatively new priority. In 2020, the government, the Parliament of Georgia, accepted the law on rights of persons with disabilities, which is fully in line with CRPD. And it basically introduced a new concept of inclusion, participation, nothing about us without us principle. And it introduced this principle not only on the central level, but municipal level. So it brought local governments and local municipalities into the picture, which we think is the predominant or primary benefit for success, for future success, to decentralize and to ensure that all people, regardless of their geographic area, have similar access to the social services. One of the most important and I'd say daring and challenging reforms we've started over the past 5 years is move from the current medical model of disability to social model of disability, and why we think it's important. Every benefit that we give out at the moment, whether cash or non-cash, services, they are contingent to the status of the person with disability. Status currently is granted by the medical model, and only medical condition is assessed. So there are people who are in need of social services that are unable to receive social services because they do not have the status, because their medical condition is not part of the list. Hence, what we've been doing together with our international partners and with support of international partners is we're introducing functional assessment of the need, which assesses not only medical condition, but social conditions, functional, their functions, and evaluates the necessity of the services and identifies necessity of the support and services necessary per person, individually, which is a great methodology, but it comes with challenges because at one point we are fully dependent on the personnel, and it will potentially increase demand and the need for social services. And we need to brush up on the social services component and provision of social services and accessibility of social services, variety of social services to fit individual needs of persons with disabilities, including assistive technologies, including inclusion support, including personal assistance, home care. Part of the reason home care and personal assistance has become on the top of the agenda for Georgia is that previously, and we did inherit post-Soviet reality in Georgia where large institutions were provided for people with disabilities as the primary housing or care facility. And we've invested a lot in the institutionalization process, and we've developed alternative services. But the next level to alternative services that are community-based and that do support integration of people with disabilities in communities is to prevent institutionalization completely. And you can prevent institutionalization by introducing home care and personal assistance services, which is fairly new for Georgian reality. We've only introduced it this year, personal assistance and home care. And we yet have to see the results, the positive results of the programs. But we think that with increased municipal support and increased decentralization of social services and increased mandate of local governments in identification of the need and provision of services to people with disabilities, and with increased political support from central government, including allocation of proper resources for provision of personnel and training of staff necessary for social services, provision of necessary resources to diversify the services from central government will really result in full integration. And we have a lot to do and a long way to go, but the progress is quite fast, and we are hoping to keep up the progress that we have over the past 2 years now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamila. I mean, given that you only have 2 years, that seems like a lot of work went into, and then like a decentralization, mixing different modalities, cash plus like a social assistance, services and other forms of the support. These are all kind of exemplary, kind of need-based approach, and then given that the people with a disability has completely different needs and then cannot be just measured by medical condition. So congratulates on the success so far. I think I feel like a little bit stupid asking for the measurement of success at this point, but I think like a good work in progress, and then like hope for all the best. Now, like we turn to PIP. There are a lot of like vulnerable people. The keynote address yesterday was actually mentioning about the persistent informality on the workforce side, especially Asia and the Pacific, which is in different nature than Latin America, as you pointed this morning. Then also COVID-19 pandemic revealed the large missing middle, like who were not vulnerable, but when the grave shock actually hits, they become all vulnerable and they're falling into poverty. And then linked with the job opportunity and the economic opportunities as well. Some countries in the region also face rapid aging. So there are a lot of like changes. Labor market is also evolving quickly with the technological and structural changes. So given all these challenges, here comes the big question for you. What are the key emerging trends and lessons in expanding social protection programs to cover these like kind of new emerging vulnerable population? Then how can we strike the balance among the coverage, adequacy, and sustainability? It's a safe world question. Sorry for that.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you to ADB for inviting me to join the panel. I'm going to focus primarily on old age financial protection and health protection. But I think it has implications for the broader safety net coverage and other issues as well. The informality point, I think, has been made very clearly, and I wasn't here yesterday, but I believe was yesterday as well. The only 2 points I'd make there to reinforce that, one is that we all hope, and we've all assumed, that informality will gradually drift away and be part of our distant history at some point in our lifetimes. But for many countries in the world, that's simply not the case. There's been this stagnation of informality. Not all countries, your China's, Turkey's, Costa Rica's and others, that's not the case. There has been progress, but in general not. The other distinction I would say is it's very important to distinguish between the Latin Americas, which are what I would call 50-50 countries, half formal, half informal, and most of the countries in Asia, which are more like 70-30 or 80-20 countries, where the large majority are informal, and the large majority have been informal for a long time and probably will remain informal for a long time. How you think about policy of expanding coverage in those two, I think, differs quite considerably. In Latin America, you worry about incentives, labour market and other things. I would suggest that you worry a lot less about that in Asia than coverage expansion itself. So that's on the informality. I think that lesson, or what those messages that I'm just giving, has been taken on board in the social health insurance space in this region to a large extent, or to some extent. There's been much greater progress towards universal health coverage than there has been towards expansion of old age financial protection programs, with the exception of social pensions in some cases. And that's driven by subsidies. It's not driven by formalisation, it's not driven by anything else. It's driven by subsidies, government subsidies. So whether that's China, whether it's Thailand, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's Vietnam, all those countries, the expansion has come with increased government subsidisation. That may be just of the poor, it may be the poor and the near poor, or like in China and Thailand, it may be a much wider group of informal sector people. So that's clear. What it means is then that the blurred lines where we talk about social insurance and we talk about social assistance separately, those lines in the space, the health insurance space, are gone in many countries. And those lines will need to blur more and more in the social protection space also. That said, though, the average coverage is shallow in health protection still in the region, and out-of-pocket spending remains high. So even some of these countries like Vietnam, who've moved towards 90% or more health insurance coverage with subsidies, have also seen out-of-pocket spending increase in that period. So you shouldn't, that's the second message, is that coverage and depth of coverage or adequacy of coverage are two very different things. So health's made great progress on the first of those, much less progress on the second. in this region. If we switch to old age financial protection, and particularly first contributory schemes, there's been much less coverage, as you know. Part of that is just inherent. It's much harder to get people to save for the distant future than to get saved for my possible health emergency tomorrow, or my baby coming next year, or whatever it may be. First thing to say was, again, our coverage numbers are deceptive. They're very incomplete to start with, we know that, but they're also shallow. The percentage of active contributors amongst those who are supposedly covered is often low. Take a country like Malaysia, now almost a high-income country. Only 50% of its coverage is active contributors. Contribution density across people's lives tends to be half or less of what a full contribution history would look like. So even those who are covered are not really covered in terms of old age financial protection much of the time, or a significant amount of the time. If we then move to those who are not covered in the informal sector, I think there's been a lot of innovation here. And I would point to probably 5 or 6 things. One is matching contributions, and you see that in countries like Thailand, China, Vietnam, Malaysia, and others. And that's achieved a certain degree of coverage expansion, but in no case, with the possible exception of China and Korea in this region, has it really gone a substantial amount of the way to addressing this missing middle problem that Katinka talked about. So that's one. Second is bundling. Bundling old age financial protection with short-term benefits. And that's the myopia problem that you're dealing with there. So nobody worries too much when they're young about the distant future, but they do worry about health, they do worry about maternity, they do worry about death in the family and catastrophes like that. So by bundling, more and more countries are incentivising people voluntarily to participate, often together with the financial incentives. The third is simple, kind of flexible, it's really delivery system improvements that make it easier to contribute, that use auto-enrolment, default contributions and other things to try and get there, to make it simple for people who are inclined to contribute to do so. And a fourth would be financial literacy, which clearly is massively needed. And whenever one sees surveys in the region of basic financial literacy, most of the people in this region do not understand compound interest, do not understand investment returns that compound, do not understand the impact of time on savings and on financial protection in old age. And that's overwhelmingly the case, even amongst educated people often. So that's really important. The final thing has clearly been social pensions, and there's been enormous expansion of that all around the world, and in this region included. But you see, again, enormous variety, from 2% coverage of the elderly to close to 100%, or Timor, 100% coverage. So what we mean by a social pension and its coverage is highly varied across the region. The second thing that's not varied is that in nearly every country in this region, no matter whether coverage is high, low, or non-existent, adequacy is very, very poor. In all the countries of East and Southeast Asia, social pensions are 10% or less of GDP per capita income. So they're clearly not on their own going to be enough for old age financial protection. Thank you.
Thank you, Pip. Because you kind of brought up this social pension at the end of your answer to the first question, and that we're not getting enough of you, so I will ask you another question right away. You are the director of the Centre of Population Aging Research in Australia. In Asia and the Pacific, some countries are actually rapidly aging, posing grave concerns over old age poverty and exclusion. Then, on the other hand, some countries in the region like India, Bangladesh, Philippines still have a young population expecting demographic dividend. So should there be kind of different priorities in social protection depending on the economies are in the demographic transition? Should kind of young population countries should be already consider social pensions as you mentioned, or they can't wait?
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry to have to hear from me twice in a row. Well, firstly, the demographic transition, I think you're right. I mean, it's diverse as to where countries are in the demographic transition in the Asia region. But it's not that diverse, or the patterns are not that diverse. I think different countries are at different stages. The Chinas, the Koreas, the Thailands at this extreme, and countries at the younger extreme. But all the countries, at whatever stage they're at, are going to age and are already aging at a pace that is far, far faster than the OECD countries did. So in OECD countries, it took between 50 and 110 years, in the case of the French, because they were probably having a nice long lunch with red wine and cheese, to age, to go from an ageing to an aged society. In every Asian country, whether they're there or not already, like the Chinas, or whether they're getting there, like the Malaysias, or whether they'll enter into that, like the Indonesias, that will happen in 20 to 25 years. So that's the first thing. And that speed matters, because turning around a pension system doesn't happen overnight, as we all know from our own countries, or a health system or whatever. So speed is one. Second is that it's happening at much lower income levels than it did in currently rich countries. So if you compare to peak working age population share in the United States and calibrate Asian countries to that share was reached in Vietnam at 10% of the income level of the United States. In China, at about 20 to 25% of the income level of the United States. So it's happening when countries are much poorer, and it's happening much more quickly, and typically with, as we saw in the coverage case, much lower coverage of the kind of protections one would need in old age. The implications for this, I think, for social protection systems are quite substantial. I think that speed means that pay-go pension systems are harder to sustain, and that they need general revenues. Maybe, I mean, the Georgia case is a really interesting extreme one of a country that went from a pure social insurance to a pure general revenues model. But this blending, I think, will be necessary. So pure contributory pay-go systems will just not be viable. Japan's highly formal, but 50% of its basic pension is financed from sales tax, because the demographics are such. You would either have to increase taxes through the roof or cut benefits so far that it would be politically impossible. The same is true in Germany. Other countries like my own, Australia, have been virtually, the basic pension has always been general revenues financed, or New Zealand. So that's one. But also this effect will happen not just on the expenditure side, but on the revenue side as well. As the labour force share of population shrinks, dependency ratios rise, etc., that will also mean that the revenue side, if you were just going contributory, would be problematic. What it does mean, though, for this region, again, South Asia and Southeast Asia are pretty low revenue regions. Just as you were saying for Georgia. You've got countries here that are 12, 13% of GDP total revenue. Or a country like Malaysia, almost high income, 14 or 15% of total GDP, total revenue. It's just not enough. So there's going to have to be more taxing, this is a happy message to bring, more tax and tax reform to have more efficient tax systems and to have people paying more tax. Because otherwise you're not going to be able to afford these general revenues that you need to create the coverage expansion that you want, and particularly as societies age. Other things are very obvious. With the falling fertility, drastically falling fertility, this region is an extreme case of low fertility. Korea's fertility rate is 0.78 in the most recent years. So the average woman doesn't even have one child, or average family, let's say. Let's not blame it on the women. This is a really low demography neighbourhood. With all that, and with other social change and other things, care systems have to develop, formal care systems. It's always been informal, and informal will continue to be extremely important. But without some formal care systems, as Tamila was talking about, the care burden or the care needs of older people are just not going to be able to be met. And that will disadvantage women much more than men, of course, as we know, with the way that care tends to get distributed. The final thing is, more generally, gender issues of ageing. I think one is care. and the disproportionate burden of women in care in the absence of formal care systems. The second is that with pension systems, as we all know, coverage of women is lower, adequacy of benefits is lower. East Asia is got a very mixed picture on whether there's survivor pensions in different systems. So there's a lot of gender issues in the pension systems that will need closer attention, I think, in coming years. And then finally, I would say two things. One is that the social protection system, the presentation, the keynote this morning was talking a lot about the linkages. SP, I think, in an ageing world can perform many more functions in terms of incentivising work at older ages, in terms of the whole of society dealing with ageing, but particularly in the labour market. And I think social protection there with productive inclusion programs and the like and other forms of incentives can perform a bigger role than it has and will need to. And final point is that we need to stop thinking about older people in the ageing context as people who are 60 and above or 65 and above or whatever it is. Certainly 60 and above is a joke. I'm turning 60 this year, and if, you know, well, more importantly, my wife is turning 60 this year, and if I told her she was an older person, and if she told me I was an older person, I think we'd both kind of be very disappointed in one another. But it's more complex than that. I think that historically we have treated people over whatever the age is as old people. We've got to start thinking of them in their different capacities much more, whether it's capacity for work, whether it's their health status, whether it's whether they live with their family, their adult family, children or not, and a whole other set of things that I think will help us to kind of calibrate policies much more.
Thank you, Pip. That actually kind of old age has to be also defined by functional analysis rather than physical or medical condition. Tamila, I wanted to come back to you, given that you have very inspiring disability inclusive social protection program. Though you mentioned it's 2 years, that it was like a fast forwarding time for you. So when you are kind of translating this policy to implementation, what are the key lessons that you wanted to share with us?
Thank you for your question. I've discussed in my previous presentation what the government has done, but I think it's worth mentioning that without cooperation, it's without inclusion of civil society, including organizations of people with disabilities, and without service provider organizations being part of this process, it's very difficult to achieve fast progress. So what's been done in Georgia is we certainly have created demand through legislation, through mandatory participation of local municipalities, through numerous platforms of communication with people with disabilities organizations. We've created demand for services and expectations. What needs to be done is, what it also created is the lack of workforce, basically, in social care and social services. While we did commit ourselves that we will have adequate social services in all areas, geographic areas, and all levels of population, the capacity of the workforce, or in terms of numbers, in terms of skill set, needs to be developed, needs to be brought in the same context and with the same pace. The way our system works is while government is funding social services, the service providers are predominantly local nonprofit organizations. Local nonprofit organizations that has been established or have been established, and local services that have been established and piloted through international support, but are now fully, supported by state funding. However, since the pilots are smaller scale, the capacity is smaller scale. So unless we formalize education for social professions, like care workers, like functional assessment specialists, it will be very difficult to meet the demand that is there and to really progress as fast as we have plans to do. So we're very closely working with service provider organizations, but also with Ministry of Education. Ministry of Education has increasingly big role here to formalize the trainings and include the training of workforce in the vocational education to ensure that the workforce is incoming and to ensure that we have availability of or potential of increasing the scale of our services on municipal level. This is something that we've been focusing on. It's a very participatory process. The other is, I've mentioned numerous times, participation and creating platforms of communication with people with disabilities to see the needs in time, on time, but also to discuss the solutions together. That really solved a lot of problems in Georgia, because what we have, our ministry has wide mandates, healthcare, social, labor. But again, following the law, it became mandatory to have these communication platforms on all levels. And our ministry has one of the biggest platforms of formalized working groups on specific subjects with participation of people with disabilities organizations. We have working group on healthcare that includes our policymakers, our counterpart governments, municipalities, and organizations, advocacy organizations, service provider organizations, and people with disabilities on the same platform. We have employment working group that is currently working on the strategy for employment of people with disabilities and inclusion of people with disabilities and promotion of employment of people with disabilities. We have service delivery working group that is working on answers of exactly the same questions that you've asked and we've been discussing today. So this really solves a major problem that it's us and them. It really unites us in the goal, including unites all of us, government, service providers, and potential beneficiaries of this entire system. And it really proved to be very successful. The communication is the key to the success because the communication brings on board everyone, and everyone is not trying to find faults in the system, but tries to find solutions in the system. And that's the key that I think is the driver in our case, and we will continue this communication in the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring. The inclusion and participation, and the really having the persons with the disability as part of the solution, deriving the solutions, it's actually a very good practice that we all have to follow. But also your comments on the human resource development needs is also resonating with what ADB is trying to do with the care industry and so on. So thank you for that. Now I come back to you, Malik, because it's not like every day we are getting you here. So as a responsible person for social protection in the Maldives, what are some key priorities in developing inclusive social protection, especially for those who have a danger of being left behind? And then what is the lessons or the remaining challenges? Again, it's a big question, but...
Yeah. Thank you, Jisun. A very important and a big question for a short intervention like this. But before I start, I'll just briefly summarize some of the social protection programs and schemes that we have. We cover every citizen across the life course at this moment through different programs. For example, the social protection schemes for special assistances, and then there's citizens that need adequate nutrition, food, water, and housing, clothing, standard of care, physical, mental, and other disabilities. and young people and children. Also, there is the universal health coverage scheme, and coming up is the unemployment benefits. We also have other programs which might not be falling into social protection per se, which is the zakat support given by the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, and then there is the emergency disaster relief funding given by the National Disaster Management Authority. For us, investing in healthcare is a priority, and the universal healthcare financing scheme is become quite expensive in that sense, with about 10% of our GDP on health expenditure. But having said that, there's a drawback as well. With the coverage, we have gains, like we have decreased mortality rates, infant mortality, maternal mortality, under 5 mortality is like very low, almost reaching 0, and our life expectancy is increased up to 80 plus. And the coverage is also given to people with chronic conditions, which in turn is a burden, because we have among our mortality, about up to 85% of mortality is due to non-communicable disease deaths, like cancers, heart disease, diabetes, and stroke, etc. So that coverage becomes quite a number. We moving on to other areas. The gender equality and the gender gap is a highlight, whereby we have developed a gender equality action plan for the country, which also is supported by the Gender Equality Act and the Domestic Violence Protection Act. So with these instruments, we are able to decrease the gap, and we are able to decrease any discrimination which women especially face. Our participation of women in formal workforce has increased, and women in political and decision-making positions have increased. In fact, 33% of our cabinet are women, even in non-stereotypical portfolios like the Defense Ministry and the Transport Ministry. So these are some gains that we have made. In addition to social insurance and social protection assistance, other ways that we are trying to prevent people going into poverty or going into needing these resources is the investment that we are making in education. Education is free until up to grade A levels, grade 12, and then additionally we have also included first undergrad degree, which is done locally in country, to be free. And there is a loan scheme for undergrad degree studies abroad through the higher education. So this is quite an investment that we are making. One of the challenges is the geographical nature of our country. It is spread across a vast area with really small islands having very low economies of scale, if you say. So having healthcare, education, and all the other basic services in each island becomes quite expensive. So that's one challenge. And to address this, we have come up with a concept called IBAMA, which is social helpers within the island communities or community social groups who identify people who might fall into the poverty area or vulnerable areas, and then assist them by response. Also identify areas where prevention is needed. And this group includes a lot of the key institutions which are involved in social protection, like health education, police, the gender ministry, social services, the home ministry as such. And this has become a flagship program where we have decentralized the social protection services to island level. Like we have 188 inhabited islands which we govern centrally but have local councils and local governments. So decentralizing local social protection has become one of the most important work that we are doing right now. Before I conclude, I would like to point out that this system is also gazetted and put in regulation so that it is sustained. And that's an important fact that we want to maintain, even if the political agenda changes. That would be the key area that I want to focus, and I would like to thank ADB to have this opportunity to share our experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malik. Again, you mentioned about the geographic dispersiveness as a challenge, but you actually also found the solution by actually institutionalizing and even legalizing the community-based support system, which is actually quite good, lessons and practice. Actually, we can also consider, given that the inclusiveness is actually coming from the understanding what are the needs of the people who really needs. So reflecting, Katinka, I'm just down with the one last question, and it's all up to you now. But yeah, lunch time is up to Katinka. So reflecting upon all the discussions so far, we kind of heard about regional trend and regional framework, and then how countries actually kind of firming up their programs and have a lot of reforms to really to focus on the most vulnerable and then those who may be left behind. Now, then there was also a recent review of SDG in New York, just a couple of weeks. So what are the way forward to make our social protection system and programs even more inclusive in the region and achieving SDG goals?
Thank you. Just for the record, I would like to say this is also a really big question, but I'll do my best in the 5 minutes that I have. Firstly, I would like to say, yes, the SDG summit just last week, and it was the adoption of a political declaration that clearly recognizes the role of social protection and emphasizes that social protection is an important policy measure to achieve inequality, to reduce inequality, remove inequality, both within countries as well as across countries. But looking at the priorities going forward, I think a lot of them were discussed over the past couple of days in this conference, including, the trends that we see around aging, migration, urbanization, technological advances, and really importantly, of course, disasters, the increasing effects of climate change that we see in this region and which may be the single largest challenge. So let me start with this one. I think here social protection is really key to building resilience of population groups. Social protection can help to cushion the effects both of slow as well as fast onset impacts of climate change, but as we discussed yesterday, it also plays a really important role and provides good opportunities to support adaptation and mitigation efforts. So I think how to really harvest the synergies between these different sectors is something that we still need to look at and that we need to understand better, but this to me is a really important area to look at. Then secondly, the future of work. Just recently, the heads of states in the G20 Summit Declaration in New Delhi had acknowledged the need to ensure adequate social protection and digital and decent work for platform and gig economy workers. So we need more legislative clarity around these type of employment arrangements to ensure protection for these workers as well. And then, as we had been discussing over the days, as social protection becomes increasingly digitalized, we really need to look at inclusive designs to ensure that groups in vulnerable situations are not excluded. But at the same time, we also need to recognize that in this region, we still have a huge digital divide. So how are we going to reach those that do not yet have access to digitalization is another issue that really needs to be addressed, right? And then perhaps in support also of what Tamila had said, we want to create environments that foster inclusive growth. And for that, I think participation, the communication with all, the trust building is really important, including to build the national ownership, to build commitment, and to build social cohesion. But perhaps let me close with 3 messages. We have international frameworks. We have international frameworks in place that are based on the principles of universality, of solidarity, and collective financing. And I think governments should build on these existing international frameworks to build comprehensive and inclusive rights-based social protection systems that should, of course, also address the concerns and the needs of the missing middle. Then secondly, I think it is really, really critical that rather than seeing social protection as a cost, it needs to be recognized as an investment that reaps returns and has multiplier effects. And with that in mind, governments should take action to enhance the domestic resource mobilization, as we saw yesterday afternoon in the session on financing, broadening the tax and contributory base and extending contributory coverage. And also, again, fostering synergies with other policy areas to amplify the impacts of social protection. And lastly, I would like to emphasize, and this is going back to this first point that I had made around climate change being probably the single largest challenge for this region. I think it's really, really important that we move beyond ad hoc and crisis-driven interventions and really look at the opportunities to build robust social protection systems that can continue to provide well-being and productivity of the people and the economies in the region, which I think it requires political will, it requires continued effort, but this should be aligned with international standards that we have in place, international regulations that we have in place. Of course, as you had also said, always considering the specific requirements and the situation of each country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You did a very difficult job beautifully. That actually kind of quite well concluding this discussion and then also linking to the various topics that had been discussed and then to be discussed throughout the event. So before I hand over to MC and then let you go for lunch, please join me giving them a big round of applause, the eminent panel members. Thank you very much, everybody.
May I ask the panel to remain on stage for the obligatory photo after this? I just have to make a couple of announcements before we break. Thank you, Gi-Sun Song, for navigating us through that very enlightening discussion. A few reminders: at 1 o'clock, please proceed to the multifunction hall to explore the marketplace and learn more about ADB's development partners. So if you haven't been there yet, yesterday we had a very fun, festive atmosphere there, 14 booths. Do get your passport booklet stamped, and there are prizes that await. So make sure you stop by there. Remember, it's a networking area. It's a networking hotspot. There are lounges there. There are also snacks available. So a good time to do more networking there. There's also a photo wall that you may use while there. Also, we have missing headsets. If any of you accidentally took the headsets from this morning, we have 17 missing headsets. So please check your bags, your pockets. Maybe it's stuck to your pants or something. So please, if you find it, please give it to the ushers. If not, we won't let you leave this place. So please check. So 17 headsets missing. If you find that in your bag tonight, you can bring it back tomorrow. So please, also let me remind you that we need your help in asking. I see everybody looking now. Yes, please check your bags. We asked you this morning to answer a survey. We need your help to assess the learning and knowledge sharing needs in the Asia-Pacific region so that we can better design and implement inclusive and effective social protection systems. So you'll see a QR code there in the back, there beside Mariana over there, and also outside at the registration desk and at the socialprotection.org booth in the marketplace. So you cannot get away from this QR code. We ask you to just scan it, spend a few minutes maybe with your friends networking, and just answer this very quick survey. We have the QR code being held up there in the back. So we would really appreciate your help with this. It really helps move the agenda forward. So please take a few minutes for that. So the parallel sessions will begin this afternoon at 2 p.m. We know that some of you have commented that your questions that you put on at Events Air were not raised during the plenary. Well, this sets the scene for the discussions in the afternoon, so you may raise your questions and comments there again. Please do that, and we'll be able to address that later on. Lunch will be served at the executive dining room, same as yesterday. Again, the parallel sessions resume at 2 o'clock. Enjoy your break, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Thank you very much.